Why the Underground is so hot. Thames Water Cooling Experiments. London. The London Underground, often simply called the Tube, is more than just a transport network. It is the living, breathing artery of London, carrying millions of commuters, tourists, and workers beneath the capital every single day. First opened in 1863, it is the world's oldest underground railway system, and while it is rightly celebrated for its heritage and engineering brilliance, it has also carried with it a problem that has never truly gone away: heat. Anyone who has stepped into its deep tunnels during summer will understand the sheer intensity of the warmth that lingers, a thick, heavy heat that feels almost inescapable. This heat is not simply about discomfort, it has serious implications for health, safety, and efficiency. Passengers faint during heat waves, trains are delayed by overheating systems, and Londoners increasingly question how sustainable the Tube is in an age of rising global temperatures. Unlike modern metro systems that were designed with climate control in mind, London's Underground was built at a time when ventilation and passenger cooling were barely considered. The clay that surrounds the tunnels, instead of absorbing and dispersing the heat, locks it in and stores it year after year, turning the deep level lines into ovens. The result is that stations like Oxford Circus, Victoria, and King's Cross can feel far hotter than the streets above them, leaving millions of people battling intense conditions on their daily journeys. Recognizing this as more than just a seasonal nuisance, engineers and city planners have begun looking for innovative solutions. One of the boldest and most fascinating experiments turns to the River Thames, the ancient waterway that has defined London for millennia. By using its cool waters as a natural heat sink, engineers hope to transform a centuries-old problem into a modern showcase of sustainability and urban resilience. The heat inside the Underground has puzzled engineers, passengers, and city leaders since the earliest days of its operation in the 19th century. When the Metropolitan Railway first opened in 1863, it was hailed as a marvel of modern engineering, a revolutionary way to move people quickly across the congested streets of London. Yet even then, complaints about the oppressive heat appeared in newspapers and letters from passengers. Victorian travelers described the carriages as suffocating, with stifling air that seemed to grow heavier with every mile. These early experiences planted the seed of a problem that would only grow worse as the network expanded deeper beneath the city. When the transition from steam locomotives to electric trains came in the early 20th century, many hoped it would end the misery of smoky, overheated tunnels. It certainly removed the choking black fumes of coal-burning engines, but it did little to solve the underlying thermal issue. Every train, even the newest electric models, generates enormous amounts of heat through braking systems, motors, and lighting. With hundreds of trains running each day, this heat does not simply vanish, it accumulates. The soil and clay surrounding the tunnels act like an insulating blanket, trapping warmth underground and preventing it from escaping back into the atmosphere. Over the decades, this created what engineers call a heat soak, where the very earth itself becomes saturated with the underground's energy. Instead of dispersing naturally, the warmth lingers, intensifying each summer. Unlike newer metro systems such as those in Singapore or Hong Kong, designed from the ground up with climate control and large ventilation systems, the Tube inherited its Victorian blueprint, which left little space for airflow or modern cooling infrastructure. The narrow tunnels, small passageways, and compact stations make it nearly impossible to install large-scale air conditioning without costly and disruptive reconstruction. Thus, Londoners today ride a system that remains one of the most iconic in the world, but also one of the hottest, where each journey is not just about distance traveled, but about enduring a thermal legacy left by 19th century engineering choices. By the dawn of the 21st century, the heat problem in the Underground was no longer just a matter of historical inconvenience. It had become a pressing crisis, demanding immediate solutions. London was experiencing increasingly intense summer heat waves, and deep-level lines such as the Central and Victoria were becoming notorious for their extreme conditions. Temperatures on some platforms and trains soared to 35 degrees Celsius or higher, levels that were not only uncomfortable but dangerous. To put the severity into perspective, livestock in the UK are legally not allowed to be transported in conditions this hot. Yet millions of humans were expected to endure it daily on their commutes. Reports emerged of passengers fainting, sweating profusely, and struggling to breathe in overcrowded carriages. Complaints flooded transport for London's offices. Newspapers ran stories about the Tube heatwave, and health experts warned of potential risks to elderly and vulnerable passengers. Climate change was adding urgency to the problem, as hotter summers became more frequent and prolonged, making what was once an occasional issue into a recurring annual challenge. Engineers attempted short-term fixes such as installing industrial fans at stations, using heat-reflective paint on trains, and trialing experimental cooling panels. While these measures offered some relief, they did little to address the deep-rooted issue. The tunnels themselves were heat reservoirs, storing decades of accumulated energy. The more trains ran, the worse the problem became, creating a cycle of rising temperatures that seemed almost impossible to break. Unlike cities like Dubai or Singapore, which had the advantage of designing climate-controlled systems from the start, London faced the monumental task of retrofitting comfort into infrastructure built in a different era. The public began to wonder if the underground was fit for the challenges of the 21st century, and politicians came under pressure to act. It was in this atmosphere of urgency, frustration, and innovation that engineers began to think differently, searching not for mechanical fixes alone but for natural, sustainable solutions that could transform the way London managed its underground climate. That was the moment when the River Thames, the lifeblood of London for centuries, entered the conversation as an unlikely hero in solving a modern engineering crisis. Stretching across the city like a shimmering spine, the Thames has always been central to London's identity, providing water, trade, defense, and even inspiration for poets and painters. But in the early 2000s, engineers began to reimagine its role, not as a scenic backdrop but as a vast natural cooling reservoir lying in plain sight. The idea was simple in theory but daring in practice. Pump water from the river, circulate it through a heat exchange system connected to underground stations, absorb the excess heat trapped below, and then return the slightly warmer water back into the Thames without disrupting its ecosystem. By doing so, the underground could tap into a renewable, constantly replenishing resource that required far less energy than conventional air conditioning systems. For a city steeped in history, the symbolism was striking. The same river that had once powered trade ships, fed industries, and even supplied drinking water would now cool the arteries of a 21st century metropolis. The proposal represented a bold marriage of nature and technology, where the geography of the city itself became part of the solution. Engineers pointed out that the Thames maintained relatively stable temperatures compared to the extremes underground, making it an ideal candidate for absorbing surplus heat. Environmental groups were cautiously optimistic, provided that safeguards were in place to prevent ecological harm. Politicians and transport leaders embraced the vision, seeing in it not just a technical fix, but a story of London's resilience and creativity. For passengers, the very thought of the river working silently to cool their journeys offered a fresh sense of hope. It reframed the problem from one of endless discomfort to one of imaginative adaptation, turning the narrative of the underground from a system trapped by its Victorian past into one that could be reborn, through harmony with the natural world running above it. The first practical experiments with Thames water cooling were carried out on some of the most overheated parts of the network, particularly stations along the Victoria Line where passenger complaints were loudest and most persistent. Engineers designed a pioneering system that worked by channeling cool water sourced indirectly from the Thames via intermediate facilities into heat exchange units installed within station ventilation shafts. These units acted like the lungs of the underground, pulling in overheated air from the tunnels, passing it over coils filled with chilled water, and then releasing it back at a significantly lower temperature. The process, though invisible to most commuters, represented a quiet revolution in how London thought about managing its underground climate. Unlike traditional air conditioning, which requires heavy machinery and consumes enormous amounts of electricity, this system leaned on the natural coolness of the river, reducing both energy demand and carbon emissions. The elegance of the idea lay in its sustainability. A renewable local resource was being used to solve a problem without resorting to energy-intensive artificial fixes. Engineers compared it to district cooling networks used in places like Paris and Toronto, but adapted to the unique geography and infrastructure of London. The stations chosen for the first trials, such as Victoria, were particularly symbolic. Known for their congestion and suffocating heat during rush hour, they became the testing grounds for whether such an innovative approach could make a measurable difference in daily commuter life. For those involved in the project, the stakes were high. If successful, it would not only improve passenger comfort but also set a precedent for how historic transport systems around the world might adapt to the pressures of climate change. The Thames, once the source of London's industrial might, was now being reimagined as the savior of its most vital public service. proving that sometimes the answers to the most modern challenges lie hidden in the natural rhythms of the past. When the Thames cooling system was first switched on, the results spoke louder than any press release or technical report. Commuters stepping onto platforms along the Victoria Line who had long braced themselves for the suffocating wall of heat began to notice a subtle but meaningful difference. The air, while still warm, no longer felt unbearable. It was as though an invisible hand had lifted a heavy blanket that had smothered passengers for decades. Engineers recorded measurable drops in tunnel and platform temperatures, especially during the punishing afternoon peaks. These were not dramatic, refrigerator-like chills. No one expected the underground to feel like an air-conditioned office, but the difference between oppressive heat and tolerable warmth was profound. For elderly passengers, parents traveling with children, and those with health conditions, it meant the difference between dreading a journey and completing it without fear of fainting or exhaustion. Transport for London officials hailed the trial as a breakthrough, pointing out that it had been achieved without tearing apart the historic fabric of the tube. Passengers began sharing their experiences in newspapers and on radio talk shows, describing how journeys that once left them drenched in sweat now felt survivable. Even during the hottest weeks of the summer, critics who had dismissed the idea as impractical or symbolic found themselves rethinking their skepticism. The project had shown that cooling a Victorian-era transport network did not require reinventing it from scratch, but rather reimagining its relationship with the city's natural resources. For many, this shift represented more than just comfort. It was a cultural moment. The underground, so often associated with frustration and discomfort, was being rebranded as a space where innovation could directly improve everyday life. The Thames, flowing silently above, was no longer just a river dividing the city, but a living partner helping Londoners survive the challenges of modern urban heat. It was a quiet but powerful reminder that resilience is often found not in radical reinvention but in thoughtful adaptation. The success of the Thames water cooling trials quickly drew attention beyond London, as engineers, urban planners, and transport authorities in other major cities began to study the model. New York, Paris, and Tokyo, all cities with extensive underground networks and rising summer heat challenges, watched closely, intrigued by the prospect of using natural water sources to cool public transport systems. What made London's experiment so compelling was not only its engineering ingenuity but its symbolism. It showed that old infrastructure could be reimagined rather than replaced, that Victorian tunnels could coexist with 21st century sustainability. Reports were published in academic journals. Conferences highlighted the project as a case study, and delegations from foreign transport authorities visited London to see the system in action. Suddenly, the Thames was being talked about not just as a historic river but as a pioneer in urban climate resilience. Environmentalists also embraced the concept, praising it as an example of how cities could adapt to climate change without resorting to energy-hungry mechanical cooling. By using the river's natural temperature stability, London was reducing reliance on artificial refrigerants, which are notorious for their environmental impact. For passengers, this global attention only reinforced the sense of pride that their city was leading the way. They were part of a living experiment, one that might inspire similar innovations around the world. The narrative began to shift. The London Underground was no longer just an aging network struggling to cope with modern demands. It was also a testbed for forward-thinking climate solutions. The humble act of stepping into a cooler tube carriage during a sweltering July day became connected to a global story about how humanity can creatively adapt to hotter cities. The Thames project, though still in its infancy, had managed to elevate London's reputation not just as a city of history, but as one of ingenuity, where the past and future worked hand in hand to solve problems that affect millions daily. Yet, as promising as the Thames water cooling system appeared, it was far from a simple plug-and-play solution. Engineers quickly encountered a host of challenges that underscored the complexity of marrying natural systems with century-old infrastructure. One of the first hurdles was the variability of the Thames itself. Unlike the steady, controlled environment of a mechanical chiller, the river's temperature shifts with the seasons. In colder months, the water provided excellent cooling potential. But during unusually hot summers, the river itself warmed, reducing its efficiency as a thermal sink. This meant that the system had to be designed with adaptability in mind, using backup chillers and hybrid cooling strategies to ensure a consistent passenger experience. Environmental concerns also loomed large. Regulators demanded assurances that the warmed water being returned to the Thames would not harm fish, aquatic plants, or the river's delicate ecosystem. Engineers installed monitoring systems, strict safeguards, and heat dispersion methods to ensure compliance, turning the project into not only an engineering challenge but also an environmental balancing act. There were also logistical difficulties, weaving new pipes, pumps, and heat exchangers into a transport system that was never designed to accommodate them. Every installation required painstaking coordination, often carried out at night when trains were not running, to avoid disrupting the millions who relied on the network each day. Financial costs added further pressure. Transport for London was already stretched thin with competing demands: new signalling systems, updated trains, expanded lines, yet the cost of doing nothing was arguably greater. Overheated tunnels could lead to breakdowns, passenger health risks, and long-term reputational damage. Thus, every pound invested in cooling became a debate about priorities, trade-offs, and long-term vision. What emerged was a project as much about governance and foresight as about engineering, proving that solving the heat crisis of the underground was not a matter of technology alone but of political will, environmental responsibility, and a deep understanding of how natural and human systems interact beneath the streets of London. Financial considerations soon became one of the most debated aspects of the Thames Water Cooling Initiative, highlighting the delicate balance between immediate costs and long-term benefits. Installing the river-cooled ventilation systems was not cheap. It required pumps, exchangers, reinforced shafts, and complex integration with the existing tube network. Each new installation meant temporary closures, nighttime engineering works, and large investments that some critics argued could be better spent on visible improvements such as new trains or expanded services. Yet the hidden costs of inaction were even more daunting. Passengers collapsing from heat exhaustion, delays caused by overheated equipment, and the erosion of public trust in the underground system all carried real economic consequences. The productivity loss alone. Tired, overheated commuters arriving at work drained of energy was estimated to cost the city millions. Policymakers began to see the Thames Cooling project not as a luxury but as a necessity for maintaining the efficiency of London's workforce. Moreover, as climate change models projected hotter, longer summers, the financial risks of ignoring the problem only grew. Health authorities warned of the dangers of urban heat islands, and the tube was identified as one of the city's most vulnerable hotspots. Every year of delay meant higher retrofitting costs later, as the thermal saturation of the clay surrounding the tunnels continued to increase. Thus, investing in cooling infrastructure was framed as both a protective measure and a future-proofing strategy, ensuring the underground could survive another century of use. Supporters argued that just as the Victorians had invested in building the tube for their era, modern Londoners had a duty to invest in keeping it functional for generations to come. In this sense, the Thames project was not simply about lowering temperatures but about protecting London's economic heartbeat. It became a story of responsibility, balancing today's expenses against tomorrow's survival, proving once again that infrastructure is not just steel and stone, but a living system that requires continual care, adaptation, and vision. For passengers themselves, the impact of the Thames cooling experiments was felt most vividly during London's recurring summer heatwaves. On days when the city sweltered under scorching sunshine, those entering previously unbearable stations such as Victoria, Oxford Circus, or King's Cross began to sense the difference. The air, while still warm, felt lighter, less suffocating, and noticeably more breathable. Commuters who once dreaded their journeys described the change as subtle but transformative, like the difference between being trapped in a sauna and standing in the shade on a hot day. For many, this was not just about comfort but about dignity and safety. Elderly passengers no longer felt the same risk of fainting. Parents with small children were relieved to travel without constant anxiety, and office workers could finally arrive at their destinations without being drenched in sweat before the day even began. The psychological effect was just as powerful as the physical relief. Newspapers and radio shows picked up on these stories. Reporting how London was finally tackling one of its most infamous commuter complaints. Tourists, too, noticed the improvement, reinforcing the city's image as a place that respected both history and modernity. The tube, so often maligned as claustrophobic and outdated, began to be reimagined as a symbol of ingenuity, a place where Victorian engineering was being cleverly adapted to meet the pressures of the 21st century. For Transport for London, this public approval was invaluable, helping to justify the significant investment in the cooling project and building momentum for expansion. Most importantly, the cooling system changed the narrative. The underground was no longer just a network passengers endured. It was something that could evolve, improve, and respond to their needs. This rebranding mattered in a city where infrastructure is as much about public perception as about technical performance. In every sense, the Thames was silently reshaping the relationship between Londoners and their underground, reminding them that innovation is not always loud or flashy. It can flow quietly, like the river itself, changing lives in ways commuters feel every single day. Looking to the future, the Thames Cooling Project is being discussed not just as a standalone experiment but as the foundation for a much larger vision of urban climate management. Engineers and city planners have proposed expanding the system to more stations, particularly those on the central and northern lines, which suffer some of the worst summer heat. But the ambition goes further than just cooling the tube. The idea is to integrate underground cooling with wider district cooling networks that could serve offices, residential towers, and commercial spaces above ground. Imagine an interconnected system where the same technology that makes a Victoria Line platform tolerable in July also keeps nearby buildings cool, reducing the overall need for energy-hungry air conditioning across central London. Such a model would turn the Thames into a thermal backbone for the entire city, a renewable resource flowing not just as water but as comfort, efficiency, and sustainability. Proposals have also suggested pairing river cooling with renewable energy sources like solar and wind, ensuring that pumps and exchangers run on green electricity. This would not only lower costs over time but also help London meet its carbon reduction targets. Urban resilience experts have praised the project as a blueprint for how old cities can adapt to climate change without demolishing their historic infrastructure. For passengers, this vision represents hope, an underground that is not merely tolerable in the summer but genuinely comfortable year-round. It is a shift from reactive firefighting to proactive city design, from patchwork solutions to holistic planning. The Thames Cooling Project demonstrates that solutions to modern crises do not always come from building something entirely new. Sometimes they emerge from reimagining what is already there. If scaled successfully, it could redefine how London thinks about its relationship with the river, transforming it once again from a boundary between north and south into a unifying force that sustains life above and below the surface. Ultimately, the story of why the underground is so hot and how the Thames may help to cool it is a story of adaptation, creativity, and resilience. When the Victorians built the first tunnels in the 19th century, they could never have imagined a future where millions of passengers would ride in deep-level tubes. During record-breaking heat waves caused by global climate change, they built for their own time, solving the immediate problems of congestion and smoke, but leaving behind thermal challenges that only grew worse as the decades passed. Today's engineers inherit that legacy, standing at a crossroads where they must preserve the historic character of the world's oldest metro system while protecting it against the pressures of the 21st century. By turning to the Thames, London has demonstrated that innovation does not always mean replacing the old with the new. It can also mean rediscovering and reusing the resources that have always been there. The river has been a lifeline for trade, industry, and identity for over 2 millennia. And now it quietly lends its strength to make the underground survivable during the hottest months of the year. This is more than engineering. It is a narrative of how cities learn, adapt, and reinvent themselves while remaining true to their heritage. The underground may never be icy cold like the climate-controlled metros of Dubai or Singapore, but with the river's help it can remain safe, comfortable, and sustainable for generations to come. For Londoners, this represents more than a technical fix. It is a reassurance that their city will continue to evolve, rather than crumble under the weight of its own history. For the world, it is an example of how natural resources can be harmonized with human systems to solve problems in ways that are elegant, efficient, and deeply symbolic. The Thames Cooling Project shows that when imagination meets necessity, even the hottest tunnels can find relief, and even the oldest cities can discover new ways to thrive in a warming world.